Hey everybody, Evan here. So continuing on with our news app project, the first thing that I want to do is, as I said last time, we're going to switch from using Sublime Text, which is a perfectly fine text editor, but it doesn't have a whole lot of bells and whistles, and we've seen that it has some trouble interpreting .vue files. We're going to move from using Sublime Text to a different IDE entirely. And what we're going to be using is Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code. It's a great IDE. It's a great text editor. So go ahead and download that. Get started with it. It's very straightforward. I'm not going to show you how to install it. I already have it. Now that said, once you do install it and open it up, I already have my news app open here, but you can simply go to File, Open Folder, find the View News app, select Folder, and it will open just like this, exactly as you see in my window here. Now, when you do first open it and try to access a .vue file, it might not read it appropriately at first glance. But what it will do is it will see that this is a .vue file, and it's going to suggest an extension for you. It's going to suggest an extension. All you need to do is select OK, install it. I think you'll see a pop-up window right down here at the bottom, and it will automatically install that for you. Here it is right here on mine. VETUR. It's a view tooling for VS Code, and it allows Visual Studio Code, VS Code, it allows it to correctly interpret a .vue file. All right, so where did we leave off? Let me go ahead and get this news app up and running by opening up a git bash window or a terminal window here in my project folder and run npm run serve. And notice that it found a couple of errors, but they're not breaking the app, and I'll explain what those errors are about in a little bit. But our app is now running at localhost 8080, so I'm going to go ahead and navigate to localhost 8080, and here we go. Here's our app. We see these news articles automatically populating. We see our search bar. If we type in something and hit submit, it will load articles relevant to that search query that we put in. Okay, so everything is working as we might expect. Let me just double check that we're not getting any errors in the console. Nope, everything looks good. So to jump back into the code, the goal for right now is to incorporate an additional feature into this app, and that's going to be filtering. So once we've actually queried and once we've actually fetched articles from our API, we're going to try to filter them. I'm sorry, not filter them, sort them. We're going to try to sort them. So the first thing you want to think about when considering a sorting feature, which is very, very common in a lot of web-based UIs, is what do you want to sort by? How do we want to sort these articles? Do we want to sort them by title? Do we want to sort them by author? Do we want to sort them by source, or all of the above? That's a decision that we need to make. So in my case, I'm going to start and keep it simple, and I'm just going to offer the option to sort by title or by author. Okay, maybe not. A source is another good one, and maybe we'll add that in if there's time, but title and author for now. If after the fact you want to try incorporating source on your own, go for it. If you want to dig into the data that returns from the API and try to incorporate the date of the article, the date and time, that would be awesome. That would also be a very intuitive criteria for sorting these articles. But in order to do this, we need to figure out how a user is actually going to activate the sorting feature. And the decision that I made for that is to use a series of radio buttons. Oops. And you should be familiar with what a radio button is. If not, you'll see soon enough. And what I'm going to do inside this div here, which is below our search bar, is I'm going to create an input with type equals radio. And I'm going to give it an ID of title. This is going to be the radio button that corresponds to the title, sorting by title. And I'm also going to give it a value of title. Okay. And then right above it, I'm going to add a label so that our users will be able to see what it is. I'm going to give the label a for attribute for title, and this is going to tie it directly to the ID of this input element. The for attribute receives an ID of a different element, which this label is for. I'm going to copy and paste this and create an identical pairing for author. Save. And now we have two radio buttons in our app. Obviously they're not working, and that's fine. In fact, let's put a line break in between them. Okay, title and author. We're not worried about styling right now. So how do we make these work? How do we make these effectively sort our articles? The first problem is we only want to sort by one of these criteria at one time. Only one of these radio buttons should be clickable or selectable at one time. Right now I've got both of them selected. That's a problem. But an easy way to fix that, and an easy way to fix that using Vue, is just like we added search query or search queue as a new data key last time, we're now going to add a new data key called sort criteria. And this is going to be an empty string when our page loads. Okay, a new data key called sort criteria set to an empty string. And then what we're going to do is use the vModel directive to model this input, and I'll explain exactly what that means. Model this input to that sort criteria data key. Exact same directive in both of these inputs, or all of them if you're doing more than two. Okay, I'm going to save, and now if I click on title, title is selected. If I click on author, author is selected and title is deselected. So now I can only click on one of these radio buttons. I can only sort by one of these criteria, which is what I want. So that's perfect. Now what does the vModel directive do? It's easy enough to look it up in the Vue documentation, which is very, very clear. But in a nutshell, it's the equivalent of binding the value of this element to this data key. It's the equivalent of binding the value of this element to this data key. So in other words, if I click on this radio button, on this input, then the value of this input, which is author, is inserted into the value of this data key. So right now, sort criteria equals author. If I click here, the value of this input, which is title, is inserted into the value of this data key. So as soon as I click here, the value of sort criteria is title. Now it's author, now it's title, etc., etc. It can only be one thing at a time, and as a result, as soon as it changes, the other input, whose value is directly tied to the value of sort criteria with two-way data binding, is automatically deselected. It cannot be both of these things at the same time. All right, so that's that. Now, how do we actually make this work? Well, we don't just want to just select a sort criteria. We want it to actually sort the articles that we're looking at. So when we click on one of these inputs, when our sort criteria changes, we want some change to happen here in the articles that we're fetching. So how do we do that? we're going to need to create what's called a computed property here in our view instance. Okay, and a computed property, I'm going to go ahead and collapse our getNews function and our components and the mounted function, just because we don't need them. We're not dealing with them right now. So I'm just collapsing them so it makes everything easier to see and read. Get rid of all the distractions here. So a computed property, let me show you what it's going to look like first. I'm going to add a computed property here in our instance, which is going to contain an object. And the computed property, kind of like methods, is going to contain methods. It's going to contain methods. So we're going to create a computed property called sorted articles, which will contain a function which will return some kind of value. It's going to return something. So a computed property is effectively, it creates a data key called sorted articles. Okay, so currently as is, let me just have this return this dot articles. Okay, so all the sorted articles computed property is going to do right now is return the value of our articles array, which should be filled by our getNews method, which is run when our component is mounted. In other words, sorted articles, the property, is going to equal the articles property in our data object. And to prove that, I'm going to change the articles in our v-for loop here from articles to sorted articles. And when I save, our app still works. It still looks exactly the same. Still works, functions completely, even though I changed the reference point of this v-for loop. We're no longer looping through the articles array, we're looping through the sorted articles array. And currently they're equal, so it has not changed anything. All right, so a computed property, when you add a method, add a function like this, a method, into the computed object, it creates a property with this name, as though you have created it right here inside your data object. It's as though you created it right here inside your data object. The difference and advantage of a computed property is any sort of dynamic data that is utilized inside the function that determines the value of that computed property. Any dynamic data inside this function is going to be watched constantly by your view instance. And whenever any piece of dynamic data inside this function changes, this computed property is going to execute again. This function is going to execute again, and its value will update. And any update to that value will be immediately reflected in your view. V-I-E-W, not V-U-E. In the view element of your application, in the markup. So let me demonstrate that. So first things first, what we're going to need to do is we don't want sorted articles to just return this dot articles. We want it to return this dot articles after they have been sorted in some way. And we need to determine how we're going to sort them. That's what sort criteria is for. So what I'm going to do first is create a new method just for sorting our articles. Okay, this is just going to be a sorting function. And I'm going to call it sort by. And it's going to be a function which takes an array to be sorted and some sort of sort criteria. Okay, so presumably these are going to be our articles, and this is going to be either title or author. And I'm going to use a basic JavaScript sort function, .sort, with my own custom function inside of it. Now, to explain how this sorting function is working is a little bit beyond the scope of this video, but I presume you're familiar with sorting arrays in JavaScript. That's all I'm really doing here. And I'm utilizing a custom function inside, a custom callback inside that automatic array sort function in order to customize how this array is being sorted. And inside we're going to have if A, the property of sort crit, is greater than B at the property of sort crit. Oops. Then we're going to return 1. And if A at the property of sort crit is less than B at the property of sort crit, then we're going to return -1. Otherwise, we're going to return 0. All right, so real quick, all we're doing here, these brackets is just another way of expressing dot notation, but it's useful for when we don't actually know what the value inside those brackets are going to be, what the key, the name of the property is going to be. So if we ran this on the first, and if we ran this sorting function on our articles, what it would do is it would take every pair of articles possible, say the first one and the second one, and it's going to check if we're using title as our criteria, is the title of article A greater than the title of article B? And that's going to be an alphabetical comparison. And if so, it's going to return 1. If it's not, if the title of article B is greater than the title of article A, it's going to return -1. If they're equal, they both start with the same letter or something, if they both have the same letters, it's going to return 0. And all this does is establish a relationship between article A and article B according to their titles. All right, so once again, I'm not going to go into any greater detail than that on the sorting function. This is just straight up vanilla JavaScript here. But now that we have that, we can use this method inside our computed property. So what do I really want to return? I don't want to return this.articles. I want to return this.sortBy, which is our method, which we just created up top, with the arguments of this.articles, that's our array, and this.sort criteria, which is our sort criteria right here. Okay, so we're plugging in the value of articles and sort criteria into the arguments of this sort by method, which will sort that array, articles, according to whatever sort criteria we decide. There's one problem with this right now, and that's the fact that when we start, when our app first loads, sort criteria doesn't have a value. And as such, this is going to break our function. This is going to break our function. It's going to break our app. Right now, it would throw an error. So we're going to handle that edge case with if this.sort criteria. So if this.sort criteria has a value, then we're going to return this. We're going to sort our articles by sort criteria. If it does not, if this.sort criteria does not have a value yet, if it's still an empty string, then we're just going to return this.articles. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, I save, my app reloads, it still works. And now if I click on title, as soon as I clicked there, sort criteria changed its value. It changed from an empty string to title. And once that happened, remember, it's being watched inside our computed function. Once that happened, this function executed again, only this time, this.sort criteria has a value. So it returns the result of this, whatever it is. If I change the value of this.sort criteria to author, it changes again. Title, author, title, author. Let's try entering the search query. sort by title, sort by author, sort by title, sort by author. Did you notice an issue though? I'm going to type in something else. Totally different query. Pay attention to the order of these 6 articles that we can see on screen right now. We have Q Computer Mouse, IBM Computer, Kano Computer, Fully Working Computer, Virtual Reality, Meet the Scientists. But look at that. Look at the fact that our author input is already checked. If I click on title, it's going to change order, predictably. If I click on author again, it changes, but not to the order we initially spotted. Okay, let me try this again. I'm going to type in computer, run it again. All right, this is the initial order, even though author is currently an active sort criteria. But now that order is different. Okay, so there's a bug here that we need to fix. Namely, when we click on this button and execute a new fetch to our API in order to retrieve a new list of articles based on this search query, we need to make sure that neither of these are checked, or rather that both of these are unchecked once a new search query is entered. And that's actually quite easy to do. If you look at our markup, the method that runs when we click on that button is in the app search component, search.vue. So that executes the change news method, which emits the news changed event with the value of our query. And if we go to the parent, we see when the news changed event is heard, it executes the getNews method. So let's expand that getNews method. This is where we run our new and updated search query to fetch new articles. And in order to achieve the effect that we're looking for and to fix that little bug, all we need to do, in addition to setting this .search query to an empty string, is set this .sort criteria to an empty string. Okay, so I'll save. I'll select title, type in computer again, and now both of them are unchecked. And I can freely sort by title, sort by author, and see the difference. Okay, so if you wanted to make this more impressive, more compelling on your own, you could add a clear button to clear your sorting criteria. That's easy enough. But remember, it would need to do more than just uncheck either of these inputs. It would also need to return the unsorted list of articles according to whatever search query you had been looking at. So you have to think, if you put in a query like technology and you sort by title and you want to clear that sort, well, if you try to fetch a new collection of articles when that button is clicked in order to reflect the unsorted array, you have to remember what search query you were initially looking at, or you risk resetting it all. Because remember, search query is in fact cleared after the at the conclusion of the previous fetch method. So that's something to think about, something that I'll probably explore at a later time. Last thing that I want to do here is I want to get rid of the submit button. I want our articles to start changing to reflect whatever query we're typing in here as soon as we stop typing. So a couple ways to do that, but first I want to show you how we can actively listen for what we're typing for inside this input. It's easy enough. So I'm going to jump into search.vue, and beneath the input and beneath the button, I'm just going to put paragraph, and inside of that paragraph I'm going to use two-way data binding to print out the value of search query. Okay. And what's going to happen is as I type in this input, we see the value of search query appear right below us. Now that's great, but you want to be careful. If we get rid of this button entirely and say have the change news method execute anytime there's a change in our input, then to perform a search for technology, we're actually going to execute 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 API calls. That's much too many. We don't want to execute an API call every time there's a change, which we can obviously see is recognized immediately in this input. We just want to see an API call execute when we have finished typing. And there is an easier way to handle that. So under vModel here, we can actually add a modifier. We can add a modifier to vModel.lazy. Believe it or not. No errors. And now watch that empty space below our input as I type in our input. It's blank. And then it's not. I'll show you again. It stays as technology, but as soon as I click out, it changes to reflect exactly what I typed. That's what we want. That's good to me. So let's go with that. Get rid of this button element. I'm just going to comment it out. But we're going to change the way we're binding this data. Rather than using vModel, I'm going to still use that same modifier that we just practiced with, but I'm going to use instead vOn, shorthand for which is the @ symbol. And I'm going to go with @change.lazy equals change news. Hopefully you can understand the principle that's going on here. I'm going to save. And let's reload the app, clear everything. And let's type in a new query. Looks like since I'm no longer actually binding the value, we still need to bind the value of this input to search query. That was my mistake there. And that doesn't need to be lazy, just so long as the change news method executes lazily. Let's try this one more time. Reload. There we go. All right. So if I type in something new, so far nothing has happened. As long as my cursor is in that input and active, nothing has happened. But as soon as I click out of here, it executes. Okay, and now I can get rid of that paragraph to demonstrate the change in the value of search query. Okay, so that .lazy adds a very, very useful modifier to either a vOn event or even a vModel. And it doesn't have to be changed. We could use an event like keyup. How is that going to change anything? Well, let me type in something different and reload. Oh, that's right. Okay, so key up and key down actually have a different system for modifiers. So you need to be careful there. You can't use it in that way. However, I would encourage you to experiment with how you could, in fact, use this .lazy modifier with all kinds of elements, all kinds of components, how you could use it to really elevate the level of interactivity with your apps, because now we no longer have that submit button, yet our application still works intuitively. It still makes sense. So, give that a try. Practice with that. Explore what other modifiers you can add here, because .lazy is not in any way the only one. And in fact, you can even create your own custom view directives quite easily. So that's fun stuff. All right, so what we've done is we've added a functional sorting mechanism to our application. We've changed our search method so that we no longer need to rely on the click of a button. All of which sort of streamlines our user experience a bit. What I'm going to do off screen is put a little bit of time into styling so it doesn't look quite so terrible, but I'm happy with where we are. For the next step, what I'd like to do is handle the edge case of what happens when these articles do not have any listed author. Most of them do, but when they don't, we just have this blank space where the author should be. We should come up with a more intuitive way of handling that edge case. And maybe we want some kind of character limit to these article descriptions, because some of them are quite short, some of them are quite long. Maybe we want a character limit to some of these titles as well. And that would help sort of unify the visuals that we're seeing here. We could certainly put some time into creating a lot nicer styling for this application, but that is not the focus of this video. In addition to those little tasks that I just said, what I'd like to do is incorporate the Pocket API to this application. So if you're not familiar with Pocket, Pocket is a great way to sort of store websites or articles or things you want to see and look at later on your own time very, very easily. So anytime I'm on a web page, I have a Chrome plugin here that just allows me to save it to Pocket, and then it gets saved to this little archive of things I'd like to read later when I find the time. So I want to add that as an API to our news application here, and that's going to give readers the opportunity to say, oh, I want to read about this later, I'm going to add it to Pocket. There will be a little button underneath the article that they click on, which will add to their Pocket. Think about what that's going to mean. We're going to need to consume another API, certainly. We're going to need to execute some new methods, definitely. We're also going to need to execute a post request, however. Okay, so if you're familiar with APIs and HTTP requests, a post request is to update or add value, add some sort of value to communicate that to an API. We're actually going to need to tell the Pocket service that our user wants to add this article to their personal Pocket. And that's also going to require authentication, because we don't want people to arrive at our news app and click on a button and have this, of all articles, be added to somebody else's Pocket. We want to make sure it gets added to their own Pocket. So they need to be authenticated, which may mean they need to sign in. And Pocket has its own process for that. So that's going to be very good practice for incorporating an entirely separate third-party API and adding a whole new layer of much more valuable functionality to this application. Finally, another goal for further down the road is to actually make these articles full articles. Right now all we have is title, author, source, and the short description. Normally, you would be able to click on the image or click on the title, and it would open up the full article page. So we're going to do that, and that's going to be easy because each of these article objects, which we're consuming here, does come with a source URL. We're simply not using it yet. All right, so that's what's next. Thanks for listening, and stick around.